Good morning.
I think we took your report. If you need it at any point, just let me know. I'll be happy to provide it to you.
Thank you.
Let me start off where the prosecutor left off. You indicated that the diagnosis included ethanol intoxication and recent cannabinoid usage.
Yes.
How are you able to determine that the decedent recently used cannabis or marijuana prior to the time of death?
The fact that there was active THC in his blood as well as some metabolites. So the body had metabolized a little bit of the marijuana. So it was in his system.
And it was used relatively recently prior to death?
Yes. And could I see my report once, actually? I might as well.
Yes.
This is Exhibit 20.
Thank you. Also, I did not see, or the toxicology lab did not pick up any cannabinoids in the urine, so that's what led me to believe it was recent use.
As marijuana is metabolized, it's eventually excreted, or its metabolites are eventually excreted through the urine, correct?
Correct.
And however recently the decedent used marijuana in this case was such that that process did not have time to be accomplished.
Correct.
Okay. The prosecutor asked you about the manner in which you discussed the presence of alprazolam and cannabis in the report. Was your indication in the report about recent cannabis usage intended to suggest that you were ruling out the possibility the decedent had been affected by the cannabis he had used prior to the time of death?
No, that was not my intention. I just can't really say one way or the other.
Similarly, we talked about the therapeutic levels. I think you described for the jury that essentially if a medication is being used properly as prescribed by a physician, these are the levels that the physician would like to see depending on how he or she prescribed it to the patient, correct?
Correct.
You're not testifying that if you find a concentration below a therapeutic level, that means it was not psychoactive, correct?
Yes, I can't say whether it was or wasn't in this case.
Subtherapeutic level concentrations of medication can have an effect on a human, can't they?
Yes.
Are you able to determine, given the weight of the decedent, how much ethanol must have been consumed in order for his blood alcohol concentration to be a 0.285%?
Now again, a toxicologist or pharmacologist would be better because they could run formulas, but I mean, we have some general rules. And I think early on, those rules are a little bit more consistent. In other words, early on in the drinking. But, you know, the decedent is an average-sized individual, so, you know, you would think each drink that he would be drinking would be giving him a level of about a 0.02. And you have to take into account as you're drinking, you're metabolizing it and that kind of thing. So time plays a factor, and amount given, ingested during amount of time and whatnot. But generally, the theory is one drink being an average beer with, you know, average alcohol content, or one glass of wine, or one shot of average liquor is going to give you about a 0.02 level. Okay, so to get to, let's say, 0.08, you would need about 3 to 4 drinks. Okay, then after that, you know, again, I would defer to a toxicologist, whatnot, but that's the general rule up front.
If we're to use this general rule, or this rule of thumb of an average drink being equivalent with a 0.02% elevation in a person's blood alcohol concentration, can we agree that a 0.285% correlates with approximately 14 drinks?
If you did the math and you said one drink for .02, it could possibly represent that much, yes.
To be clear, and I think you may have touched on this, Doctor, but just so we can clarify for the jury, when you talk about the passage of time and alcohol being metabolized, when we say an approximate calculation of 14 drinks, we're talking about the correlation between the number of drinks and the alcohol that was in the decedent's system at the time of death, correct?
The number of drinks and the amount of alcohol in his system at the time of death, yes.
So in addition to those 14 drinks worth of alcohol in his system, there could also be alcohol that was consumed prior to that but had been metabolized and eliminated before the blood sample was collected, correct?
There could be, and I mean, once again, once you start getting at these higher levels and whatnot, I think, I defer to a toxicologist, but the metabolism can kind of change and it can slow down and different things or kind of get overwhelmed. So it gets a little more gray, but yes, that's correct.
So in other words, a person would essentially have to hypothetically drink 14 drinks in rather rapid succession very soon before the time of death in order for that person to have only consumed 14 drinks and have that blood alcohol concentration, correct?
True. I mean, to reach that alcohol level, you do have to be actively drinking it, and that has to be in a relatively short time because generally one drink will get metabolized per hour. But again, once you start getting a lot of alcohol on board, it becomes a little gray and it might slow down. So, I mean, I know hypothetically we're saying 14 drinks, but I mean, it's hard for me to say exactly. I would defer to somebody else. And
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We'll move on. You talked about looking at various paths and trajectories in terms of front to back, upward to downward, and left to right. Do you recall that?
Correct.
Okay. I think we're all comfortable with front to back and upward and downward, and you did explain this before, but just so I can make sure everybody understands, sometimes the right to left part can be a little bit confusing. When you say a wound is right to left, the wounds were right to left in this case, correct?
Correct.
Okay. When you say right to left, did I get that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When you say right to left, are you talking from the perspective of the decedent or the perspective of somebody facing this?
It's always on the decedent's body. So again, they're in the anatomic position and their right side to their left side. So if I say right to left, it's some variation that goes from the right to the left.
Okay. So given that both wounds in this case were to the right of the decedent's midline, correct?
Yes, correct.
So if we're talking about two wounds right of the midline, right to left,
Correct.
the paths of those wounds go essentially from the lateral to the medial.
Correct.
They go from basically outside to the inside.
Correct.
The prosecutor asked you a number of questions about the absence of stippling from the decedent's hands. You recall that?
Yes.
Now, the prosecutor didn't come out and ask you, so I'll go ahead and do it. Does the absence of stippling from the decedent's hands mean that the decedent's hands were not in that intermediate range of the muzzle of the gun? It doesn't rule that out, does it?
No, it does not rule it out.
In fact, it's entirely possible that at the time these shots were fired, that the decedent could have had his hands extended forward towards the person who shot the gun, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I can't, from what I have, I can't say much about positioning. I can only be given, possible scenarios, but I can't rule out that.
When we talk about stippling, you described, Doctor, that there are a number of different variables that can affect the significance of it, correct?
Correct.
And that includes the type of powder that's in the projectile, correct?
Correct.
The caliber of the projectile?
Correct.
The type of firearm from which it's discharged, correct?
Yes.
Those factors can all affect not only the length from the muzzle at which the unburned gunpowder specks will continue to burn, but also how concentrated or wide it will spread as it leaves the muzzle of the gun, right?
Yes.
As you sit here today, you're unable to say how wide the unburned gunpowder specks, may have distributed as it left the muzzle of the gun, correct?
Yeah, I can only assume that, as you said, as it goes further out, it disperses more. Like if you threw a bunch of graffiti or something, it's going to be a tight cone and then disperse outward.
With that, can we agree that, again, using approximations, the presence of stippling on the clavicle wound suggests a distance between the muzzle of the gun and the decedent of approximately 2 inches to 2 feet?
I can only give an approximation, and that's kind of my rough estimate. Yeah, that it's going to be somewhere within that to be able to see stippling.
And again, acknowledging that it's an estimate, we are unable to make any conclusion or have any opinion as to whether it's closer to 2 inches or closer to 2 feet, correct?
Because of the collar and those type of issues, I mean, it makes it difficult to interpret, yeah, with specificity.
The decedent could have had his hands forward at the time shots were fired, far apart from each other to the point where the stippling would have gone in between the hands, correct?
Correct.
Similarly, the decedent could have had his hands so far close to, or even maybe just behind the muzzle of the gun, that there was never any unburnt gunpowder in the path, correct?
Again, these are possibilities I can't rule out. They're scenarios I'm given, and there's nothing there that I have that I can say that's not possible.
Okay. Let me just button it up with this and we'll move on. Can we agree that you do not have an opinion as to the position of the decedent's arms or hands at the time the shots were fired?
Correct.
Let me move on, Doctor, and talk briefly about some of the nomenclature that we use to describe the abrasions and contusions that you observed. You talked, Doctor, about fresh wounds and older wounds. Could you talk about what that means, fresh and old?
Yes, basically, I can't, a fresh wound, I mean, we've all gotten scratches and bruises and things like that, and if you've watched them heal, there's a process. So, for instance, with a scratch, it's going to have that pink appearance as the surface of the skin has been abraded or traumatized, and for a certain amount of time, it's going to look like that, and then after time, it'll start scabbing over and becoming brownish as a scab forms and those type of things. So some of the abrasions on the decedent's body had that brown appearance as though they'd happened at a more distant time than the fresh ones.
In terms of how old these injuries may be, are you able to provide any clarification or specificity as to how old the old injuries are and how recent the fresher injuries are?
Everybody's, body kind of heals at a different rate and whatnot. It also depends on where these things happen on the body. You have different vascular supply, let's say, to your skull than maybe the back of your forearm. So things heal at a different rate. So I really can't put an exact timeline. But what I can say is the red abrasions happened at a different time and the other ones are healing. So they're of varying ages, okay?
Can you rule out the possibility that some of the findings that you characterize as being older were caused at or around the time of the decedent's passing?
My opinion would be that the older wounds, they're from the distant, they didn't happen right around the time of death or at a peri-mortem time, yeah.
Days or longer before?
Yeah.
One of the other lines of question being pursued by the prosecution related to potential mechanisms of injuries for these superficial injuries. You recall that, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay. I believe specifically you were asked about some of the injuries about the decedent's head, jaw, and neck area. Do you recall that?
Correct.
Okay. And you saw both fresh and some not so fresh injuries on that part of the decedent's body?
Let me just for 1 second look at this. Yes.
I believe the prosecutor asked you if those injuries could be consistent with falling on rocks or gravel, and you indicated that was a potential mechanism of injury for that. Do you recall that?
Yeah, those would be for like the red abrasions. Yes.
It could also just as easily be as a result of falling on asphalt or pavement, couldn't it?
Yes.
It could also just as easily be consistent with the decedent lunging forward at the time he was shot and continuing in that direction, falling to the ground after he shot, correct?
Due to contact with the ground after he fell, yes.
Same questions, Doctor, with regard to the findings on the legs or the lower extremities. You observed what I believe were characterized as both some older injuries and some fresher injuries.
Correct.
The prosecutor asked you if that could be consistent with contact with a rocky area, and you indicated that it could.
Yes.
It could also be just as easily explained by contact with asphalt or pavement, couldn't it?
Yes.
And those injuries, likewise, could be consistent with the decedent lunging forward at the time he was shot and continuing in that direction after he was shot and then falling to the ground.
Yes.
Finally, same lines of questions as to the back. There was some old and fresh injuries on the right side of the back, I believe.
Yes.
Those injuries could also be caused from asphalt, couldn't they?
Well, now the ones on the back, those, let me just read this, because there was some stuff on the upper back, but those look old. But then you're right, on the lower part of the chest and upper part of the abdomen, there's some red abrasions, and yes, same, yeah.
And I'm sorry, I said back. We were talking about the front and the back of the torso and
Yeah.
the chest.
Yeah.
And again, with regard to the fresher injury on the chest, that could be consistent with the decedent lunging forward towards the person who shot the bullets at the time he was shot, correct?
And contact in the ground, yes.
Let me shift gears and move to a different topic, Doctor. The prosecutor also asked you about something called defensive wounds, and you started to give an explanation as to how that term is used in your field. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Defensive wounds are wounds that would be seen when somebody takes a defensive position, as if, if they're being attacked, whatnot, or defending themselves. So, commonly you might see something on the hands, on the forearms. You could even see them on the thighs if somebody's trying to push someone away on the ground and they're on their back. So it's sort of a category of wounds that could be consistent with somebody defending themselves.
It sounds to me like that is something that would be of more clinical significance if we're talking about a scenario where you have maybe hand-to-hand fighting or wrestling, or the decedent was killed with some type of knife or object that was held in the hand of another person, correct?
It's common to see these defensive wounds in those kind of situations, yes.
Can we agree that if we're talking about a situation where there's no allegation that the decedent and the person who fired the gun were engaged in any type of hand-to-hand combat, that the absence of defensive wounds is less significant?
Yeah, I mean, if there's not a story of or a context of defensive wounds due to the circumstances, then yes, it would be hard to categorize them as that.
Let me move on, Doctor, to the 2 gunshot wounds. To be clear, there's no way for us to determine the sequence in which these wounds were caused, correct?
I don't have an opinion as to the sequence, no.
We don't know which was first and which was second.
I do not know.
The wound paths through the decedent's body are pretty similar to each other, are they not?
The trajectories are similar.
Whatever differences there may be between the trajectories is very slight, isn't it? Aren't they?
They're similar, so they're very similar, yeah.
Sometimes when you are conducting a post-mortem on an individual who suffered a gunshot wound, you can have a situation where a projectile strikes a bony structure and may go in a different direction than it was going prior to making contact with that particular part of the anatomy, correct?
Yes, bony structures can change the trajectory.
But in this case, we're confident, aren't we, that both projectiles maintained a linear path as they entered the decedent's body, correct?
That's what I saw in my internal exam, yes.
The downward angle of the projectile trajectories is consistent with the decedent leaning forward towards the shooter at the time the shots were fired. Correct?
Again, given a scenario, all I can say is, yes, that's possible, or it's consistent with that, and certainly that's a possibility.
I want to publish 361
Diagram? Yeah, I don't, was 361 was the diagram that he did up here? Oh, okay, all righty.
This is, you recognize this as 361, Doctor?
Yes.
Okay. So I stand the jury's way. If I could borrow the laser pointer.
Yes.
Please. Thank you, sir. When you talked about the chest wound entering near the 4th rib, you talked about this entrance here, correct?
Correct.
And the projectile was recovered by the 11th vertebra?
Correct.
And we can agree that you drew these dotted or hyphenated lines to approximate the path the projectiles took through the decedent's body, correct?
Yes.
Can we agree that all things being equal, if the decedent was standing on a plane that was elevated above where the shooter was standing at the time, that the angle that the decedent would have had to rotate into in order for those pads to present in that fashion would have had to have been even further forward?
Well, like I said, given that scenario, and if we're going to say, you know, the gun's in the same position and somebody's holding it and the other person is elevated, then yeah, you would expect that that person would be in a position sort of forward to get that downward angle.
And again, all things being equal, the higher up the decedent is, the further forward he would have to be leaning in order for the trajectories to present in these angles, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, we're assuming, you know, he's standing up straight and all those kind of things, but yeah.
Thank you, Doctor. I got just a very brief moment, Your Honor.
Sure.
Thank you. Is there an approximation or a rule of thumb that is used in your field to determine an individual's wingspan or arm length relative to their height?
I mean, I'm sure there's formulas out there. I don't really use that. I mean, once in a while we'll measure, you know, from shoulder to fingertip or whatnot. But yeah, I'm sure there's formulas out there.
Just one last thing to clarify. The absence, there was stippling noted by the shoulder wound, correct?
Correct.
There was no stippling identified by the chest wound?
Correct.
The absence of stippling by the chest wound does not mean that it was caused at any distance greater or less than the distance that the shoulder wound was created, correct?
Yeah, because, you know, that went through a shirt, quite a bit of material there and whatnot on all sides of that wound. I was unable to give that a range of fire. Okay, potentially it could have been within that range. I just can't say.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor.
You're
Further
welcome.
questions?
Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Judge. Just a couple of questions, Doctor.
Sure.
As far as recent THC use, you can't say how recent, can you?
Again, I'd have to defer to a toxicologist, and they would, you know, consider, well, you know, how quickly is stuff metabolized, how quickly would it be in the urine. I can't say.
If a substance is found in the urine, is that substance found in the urine affecting the person psychoactively?
No, once it's in the urine, it's inactive.
As far as the gunpowder particles that lead to stippling, when they come out of the barrel of the gun, they're more concentrated. Is that fair?
The closer to the muzzle, the more concentrated. Yeah.
And some of those particles travel further than others. Is that fair?
Yes, there's going to be a dispersion there, and like anything, some would be traveling further than others because some are burning and that kind of thing.
So you might expect to see a greater amount of stippling if that area from the muzzle of the gun to the contact area was a shorter distance.
Yeah, like I was saying, if you threw a handful of confetti out, it's going to start out in a small pack and then it's going to kind of disperse.
Yeah.
So the closer you are to it, it's going to be more of a concentrated bundle.
And finally, Doctor, counsel gave you a variety of circumstances of the position of hands relative to the muzzle of the gun. You recall that?
Correct.
You also, if the hands were held at the sides, you also might not expect to see stippling or defensive wounds. Is that correct?
Yes, I saw no stippling or defensive wounds on the hands, so that would be a scenario, yes.
Nothing further. Thank you, Judge.
All right, I'll turn to members of our jury and see if they have any questions for the doctor. It looks like we do, so I'll go ahead and see counsel and court reporter at the sidebar. All right, Doctor, the jury does have some questions for you. The first question is, if the projectiles go downward, would this be indicative of the shooter being positioned higher than the victim, or that the victim was leaning or falling forward?
So when I do this post-mortem examination, what I have is the decedent. I don't have information without, actually being there to know the positions people were in. So, again, being presented with those two hypothetical scenarios in order to get a downward trajectory, could the gun be higher than the decedent and cause that? Absolutely. Could the decedent be leaning forward and this way? Absolutely. So yes to both of those.
The next question is, could you determine how the gun was pointed based on the projectiles?
Could I determine how the gun was pointed based on the projectiles? So, those projectiles are, this type of ammunition tends to be very consistent, the way it sort of mushrooms and deforms and whatnot. So I don't have any opinion as to the way the gun was pointed in comparison to those projectiles and the way they were deformed.
The next question is, based on the projectiles, could you for sure say the victim was leaning forward, even though on a higher plane, or that the shooter was just taller?
Based on what I have, as I explained before, I can be given certain scenarios and give an opinion as to is it consistent with that, but as far as me making an opinion as to what was happening outside of what I have, I can't make an opinion.
The next question is, do post-mortem length/mass requirements tend to skew high or low?
Could you repeat that question for me?
Do post-mortem length/mass requirements tend to skew high or low?
Oh, length and mass measurements. Again, it's, plus or minus. We give a range. I would say probably height, it would tend to be low, but weight, there's so many variables. I mean, if somebody was in the hospital and they received fluids, things like this can, increase body weight and whatnot. So I would say it tends to skew low for the height. Weight, there's lots of factors.
The next question is, it's a three-part. Are the clothes inspected for stippling?
With my eye, so grossly, I examine the clothing and whatnot, and that's my examination at the time of the exam.
And the next part is kind of a two-part question. If so, is any found on the clothes? If so, where?
I didn't see any on the clothes, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. Okay, you saw the clothing was stained. Clothing acts very differently than skin as far as when receiving things like stippling. As far as my examination, I didn't see it, but it doesn't mean it wasn't there.
And the next question is it your opinion that a straight line could be drawn through the path of the bullet in the body to the muzzle of the gun, as in the path of the bullet indicates the gun was in the same plane and the bullet's trajectory was not altered?
Could you repeat that question?
You want to take a look?
Sure, thank you. So is it your opinion that a straight line could be drawn through the path of the bullet in the body? And I mean, that's basically what I did when I did the autopsy. I came up with a trajectory, right? We said right to left, downward, and front to back. So is it your opinion that a straight line could be drawn through the path of the bullet in the body to the muzzle of the gun? So now, that's not something I do, but I mean, certainly, if that bullet flying through the air, you would assume it would be on the same trajectory unless it hits an intermediary object, like maybe it goes through a plate of glass or something like that. So, but again, that's not something I do. And then the second part of the question is, as in the path of the bullet indicates the gun was in the same plane as the bullet's trajectory was not altered. Again, what I see at the time of autopsy, I had a straight line in the body, so I don't really see the bullet altering a path as far as once it entered the body. What happened before it entered the body, I can't say.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mr. Shea, follow up.
Thank you, Judge. With regards to the height and weight measurements, Doctor, you said that you think that height or length could tend to be low.
Yeah, my measurements, it could tend to be low. I mean, occasionally it'll be high too. I mean, it's an estimate, and again, I mean, there's several factors. I don't know that I need to go into, but there's a range of plus or minus.
Roughly, what would be the?
I mean, I would say plus or minus 3 inches.
Okay. And given the location of the chest shot projectile where that was found, in the
Okay, in the 11th vertebrae, yes.
Now, the fact that that projectile impacted his spine there, could that have an effect on height or length measurement as well?
I mean, theoretically it could. I don't think that's the case here, but I mean, theoretically, yes.
If I may have a moment, Judge.
Sure.
Nothing further, Judge. Thank you.
Mr. Davidson?
Thank you. Very briefly, Doctor. There's nothing you observed with regard to the trauma caused to the decedent's spine, bones, vertebra, in this case, that would suggest it reduced his toe-to-head height or length.
That's correct. I don't feel that reduced the height by any significant amount.
And when you measured the toe-to-head length of the decedent in this case, you determined that it was 67.5 inches, correct?
Correct.
And when you say there's a margin of error plus or minus 3 inches, it could be more than 67.5 inches, it could be less than 67.5 inches, correct?
Correct.
Or it could be exactly 67.5 inches.
Correct.
Is there anything in particular or specific to this post-mortem that would suggest to you that your toe-to-head measurement is any less accurate than it would be in any other case?
No.
Let's assume hypothetically that the person who fires the gun is approximately 3.5 to 4 inches taller than the decedent.
Okay.
Okay. That is not mutually exclusive to the decedent also being at a higher plane. In other words, you could have both of those things happen. You could have a person shooting the gun who's 3.5 to 4 inches taller and a decedent leaning forward from an elevated location, correct? In other words, it's not one or the other.
Correct.
Okay. Is stippling I'm not trying to split hairs with you, but just so we're on the same page, is stippling a term specific to the changes you see on skin and other human tissue, or can we also talk about stippling as it may affect clothing or other non-organic material?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's specific to the skin or whatnot. When I spoke of the clothing, I probably should have, the term, it probably just say, is there residue on the clothing? But stippling is really a phenomenon you see in the skin, correct?
Okay. Fair to say, given the condition of the clothing, there may or may not have been residue on the clothing.
Correct.
Finally, doctor, let's assume hypothetically that there were no, what I believe you described as intermediary objects between the firearm and the decedent. We have the bullet goes directly from the muzzle of the gun and enters the decedent's body. Based on your autopsy in this case, could we draw a straight line from the resting place of the projectiles to the pistol from which those projectiles were fired?
Yes, I think we could.
Thank you, doctor. Nothing further.
Can this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you for your testimony, sir. You are excused.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Your next witness.
Thank you. The state calls Terrence Weaver.
You solemnly swear or affirm under penalty of perjury the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God or Jesus so.
I do. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Shea.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Could you state your name, please?
My name is Terrence Weaver,
And can you spell your last name for the record?
Weaver.
Where are you employed, sir?
I'm employed with the Arizona Department of Public Safety in the Northern Regional Crime Lab here in Flagstaff.
What's the, well, let's see. In October of 2015, what was your capacity at the lab?
At that time in 2015, my main duties in the laboratory would have been performing firearm and tool mark examinations.
Can you give the jury a summary of your background, education, training, and experience in firearms and tool mark examinations?
Yes, I have a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and Biology from Northern Arizona University. During the course of my employment, I've received training through the FBI. That training has included things like a symposium on trace evidence, specialized techniques in firearm identification, and bullet trajectory reconstruction. I'm also a member of the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners, which is actually the worldwide organization for people who do my type of work. I've had in-laboratory research that is often associated with the casework that I do. I've had various schools or seminars in microscopy, instrumentation, digital photography, wound ballistics, serial number restoration, and generally a diversity of topics related to firearm and tool mark examination. I've also attended armor schools for Glock, Smith & Wesson, and Colt, and I've taken some firearm-related manufacturers' tours.
How long have you been employed in that capacity?
Doing firearm and tool mark examinations about 27 years.
Always with the Arizona labs?
With firearms with Arizona. I was also employed with the Utah Department of Public Safety for a little less than 2 years.
Have you testified before relative to firearms and tool mark examinations?
I have.
Are you able to estimate how many times approximately?
It's a very difficult thing to estimate. It's not something I keep track of. In firearm tool mark cases, also gunshot residue type cases, roughly 50 to 75 times.
Specifically with regards to your field of analysis, is your lab certified or does it have certain qualifications?
Yes, our laboratory is accredited through the American Society of Crime Laboratory Directors, and some years back they also combined with ISO, which is the International Standards Organization.
What does it mean to be accredited?
Accreditation includes quite a variety of things. It is requirements to the laboratory in general. Those requirements may be safety considerations. It's also requirements for the individual criminalists, and that may include proficiency testing and general knowledge in the field.
How regularly does that accreditation process take place?
We go through various reviews, but the full accreditations, I believe they're once every 5 years.
And the various reviews are?
I'm thinking they may be yearly.
Mr. Weaver, did you do any analysis related to this case?
Yes, sir, and this is in reference to our departmental report number 2015-717-470.
All right. And indeed, you keep track of your department report numbers, what other information follows any evidence or analysis through your lab?
Yes, sir.
What other type of information, designations, DR numbers, such things?
I'm sorry. The other things that we keep track of associated with our DR numbers are agency DR numbers, the evidence associated with those DR numbers, the submitting agency and their item numbers, and then chains of custody maintained on those item numbers.
Did you produce any reports outlining your conclusions based on your analysis in this case?
Yes, sir.
All right.
Yes.
Mr. Weaver, I'm handing you what's been marked as exhibit number 99. Take a minute to review that and look up at me when you're satisfied. Satisfied that you recognize it.
Yes, sir. Exhibit 99 looks like a compilation of all of my notes, all of my reports, the requests for examination, and perhaps any addendums that came with those requests.
All right. And at the outset of your participation in this case, or at least when items were submitted for analysis, there were a number of items submitted at the same time. Is that fair to say?
Yes, sir.
Can you outline what those items were that were submitted?
Yes. And I am going to look at my reports, if I may. Item SC16 was one pistol, a Glock Model 22. Item SC37 was a pistol magazine and 6 unfired cartridges, each marked Federal, 40 S&W. Items SC1, SC2, SC4, SC5, SC6, SC13, SC15, SC22, SC23, and SC27 were each fired cartridge cases, each marked Federal, 40 S&W. Items 14, 15, and 39 were fired bullets, 3 fired bullets. And item 1094-1 was 1 fired bullet.
All right. And those, so you're referring to items and designations. Where do those item designations like SC16 come from?
Those item numbers would have come from the submitting agency or submitting agencies. And then if there are no discrepancies associated with those item numbers, we will use those same item numbers in the laboratory.
All right. And When these items are dropped off, who are they dropped off by?
It can vary. Sometimes agencies use a courier, and sometimes detectives or officers will drop off the evidence themselves.
And then there's a process for receiving that evidence at your lab, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And keeping track of that evidence until you engage in your work, is that right?
That's correct.
And and you don't necessarily get to a analysis request immediately, do you?
No, sir.
All right, so it sometimes takes some time?
Yes.
All right, and ultimately in this case, how many reports did you produce?
I produced 3 reports in this case.
And 2 of those reports were at least released on April 20th, 2016, is that right?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
And what do those reports do?
These reports list the items that I examined and list the results that I got on those items as a part of my examination.
So let's talk about one of the April 20th reports in which you made findings relative to SC16. Okay?
Okay.
And can you remind me what SC16, what item that is?
Item SC16 was a Glock Model 22 pistol.
Your approach, Judge?
Yes.
Firearm into evidence. Jury has a right to see it. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Weaver, I'm approaching you with an item that's been, an exhibit that's been marked 318, okay? And some gloves and a pair of scissors, all right?
Okay.
And use those gloves if you feel necessary. Do you recognize the packaging that is exhibit number 318?
Yes, sir, I do. This is a box under the departmental report that I mentioned earlier, 2015, 717470. It has my mark and my label as I'm holding it up now. That label includes the date on which I placed it there, the 21st of April, 2016, and the item number SC16.
Your Honor, it pleases the court, the defense will stipulate that item 1094-1 was fired from SC16. Mr. Shea?
I mean, defense counsel can offer that stipulation if they'd like. I would like to proceed with my examination.
So you're not agreeing to the stipulation?
If I may have a moment, Judge. Suppose I'll reject the stipulation, Judge, and proceed, if I may.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And what is exhibit number 318?
Exhibit 318 is, as I'm looking at it now, the exterior box that contained item SC16, the Glock pistol.
All right. Can you go ahead and open up that package, Mr. Weaver?
Yes, sir. And for the record, I'm just opening up one end of the box. And because the firearm is zip-tied inside the box, I'm going to need to completely open it up.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, sometimes it's easier with a knife than a pair of scissors. Okay, the box is completely open.
All right, Mr. Weaver, do you recognize the item contained inside the box?
Yes, sir, I do.
And what is it?
This is item SC16. It has my labels on it, again with that same DR number, the item number, and it is the label, or actually the labels that I placed on this item.
All right, that's SC16, that's the gun?
Yes, sir.
All right, and the, just preliminarily, are you able to determine based on what you're seeing right now if the gun is unloaded and safe?
No, sir, it's zip-tied to the box, and the one safety feature I see on it is that there is a zip tie that is blocking the breech of the firearm.
All right. Are you able to make sure that the gun is safe as you sit there?
My preference would be to remove it from the zip ties.
All right. Please do.
And is it okay if I handle the firearm now?
With
Go
leave
ahead.
of the court?
Go ahead.
The firearm is safe. There's no magazine in the firearm, and there's no cartridge in the chamber.
All right. Is there anything attached to the firearm?
Yes, there's still a zip tie going through the magazine well and through the receiver.
All right. Is there a light of any sort?
Yes, there is a flashlight attached to the firearm.
How is that attached?
It's attached with a clamping mechanism to what would be called the rail of the firearm.
Okay. Is that easily removed and attached? Can you tell from looking at it there?
Yes, it looks like it is.
All right. I'll ask you to take that flashlight off of the gun, if you will.
Judge, before we alter the condition of the evidence, can both parties have an opportunity to view it in its original state?
Sure. Why don't you come on up? Let me...
Judge, actually, before I ask Mr. Weaver to take the next step, I'll offer 318.
I don't object to the firearm, Judge. I just look to see what other materials may be in the box.
Sure.
No objection.
318 is admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And actually, again, before I ask Mr. Weaver to take the next step, can I ask him to show the jury the gun?
Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Weaver, can you hold the gun up in such a way as the jury can see it?
So I am holding the firearm vertically with the muzzle pointed towards the ceiling.
All right. Mr. Weaver, so I'm going to again ask you to go ahead and, if you were to take the flashlight off, would you be able to put it back on in the same position with similar ease?
I believe I could.
All right. I'm going to ask you to go ahead and take that flashlight off of there.
Okay, and the flashlight's removed from the firearm?
All right. And can you test whether or not the flashlight is currently functional?
Yes, sir. The flashlight has a lever on the back, and when that lever is moved to the left, it needs to be held down in order to operate. When it's moved to the right, it will click into position and stay on.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Weaver. I just didn't want you to have to point the gun around, so you can go ahead and put that flashlight back on.
And the flashlight is reattached to the firearm.
All right. Thank you. I guess I'll just take that package back from you, if you can put it back in the box and kind of close the box up.
Muzzle is pointed away from you, and because of it having to open the box that way, please be careful that it doesn't slip out.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Weaver. Was there also, I think you indicated there was also a magazine and cartridges submitted for your analysis?
Yes, sir, that was item SC 37.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Mr. Weaver, I'm approaching you with what's been marked as exhibit number 319. Based on the packaging, what do you recognize that to be?
Yes, sir, this is the packaging I received with item SC 37. Again, as I'm holding it up now, my label is across the top of the envelope with the same departmental report number, the item number, the date on which I put it there.
State offers 319, Judge.
Can we confirm the contents of it?
Sure.
Mr. Weaver, if you could open up the package, please.
Yes, sir, I opened up one side of the envelope and removed the contents.
And what was in there?
Inside is a magazine, a firearm magazine. It has my label on it. And then also a plastic bag containing 6 unfired cartridges. And this plastic bag also has my label on it.
All right. Were those submitted to you separately or as one item?
I could check my notes, but I believe because this is a separate plastic bag, it's not one I would use in the laboratory. I believe they were submitted separately.
State offers 3, but as one item, SC 37, is that fair?
That's correct.
State offers 319.
No objection.
See counsel up here, please.
All right. Your Honor, the state proposes to admit the magazine without the cartridges as exhibit number 319.
Any objection?
No objections.
And the state would ask that the cartridges just be marked as 319A, but not admitted.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor, I apologize for misheard. I think the cartridge should be 319D, if the magazine would be 319A. Clerk is nodding.
How do you want to do that? We normally don't do alpha designators on it. Okay. Let's do it A for the magazine, B for the cartridges. All right, we'll do 319B for the cartridges.
Okay, and so then the magazine would be admitted as
319A.
319A. Thank you.
319A is admitted.
Mr. Weaver, if you could put those items back in the envelope, please.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Couple more minutes, Mr. Shea. 2 more minutes.
All right, and you also indicated that there were a number of fired cartridge cases that were submitted to you, is that correct?
That's correct.
And then you indicated that there were 4 fired bullets that were submitted to you, is that right?
Yes, under 2 separate requests, there was a grouping of 3, and then on a separate request, another fired bullet.
And do you know where the first 3 came from?
Yes, sir, I did document the labeling on the packaging.
All right. And where did they come from?
Item 14 was labeled with the medical examiner, having come from the medical examiner on the external packaging. Inside that was another label indicating what part of the body that was removed from. Item 15 was also marked with on the external package as medical examiner. Inside that, there was another paper envelope, and that had what I believe is the medical examiner's label on it. It also was marked as to location removed from the body, but this one actually had, I believe, the name of who it was removed from.
What was that name?
The last name was Brow, and the first name was Colin.
All right. And then with regards to, and so both of those were from the ME's office?
That's how they were marked, yes, sir.
And how about item 39?
Item 39 appeared to have come from the hospital. It had different packaging. It had different markings and a different, what appeared to be an identifier number on it. And that packaging was labeled Zyntech.
And there was, with regards to a separate request, there was item 1094-1, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And where did that come from?
1094-1 was marked similarly to item 39, marked and packaged. It also had that same numerical identifier, and in my notes I said possibly came from the hospital, and it was also marked Zyntech.
Right. So with regards to that first report, can you describe, well, perhaps it'd be a good time to take the break, John.
All right, folks, let's go ahead and break for lunch. Please remember the admonition. We'll get back together at 1:30. I see counsel up here, please.